Deividas Skebas, you are now aged 25. You've been found guilty of the murder of Lilia Valutyte. I must now sentence you for that offence. You are attending today via a video link with my permission. That is because your mental health at present is such that it is better for your safety and of others that you remain in a secure hospital environment. Lilia was just 9 years old when her life was brutally cut short on the 28th of July 2022. She was playing with her little sister on the street just outside her mum's place of work. We watched images of her taken by CCTV. They show a happy, lively girl, as carefree as any 9-year-old should be, chasing her hula hoop on this warm summer's evening. She should have been safe. She was playing in a pedestrianised area and just yards away from her mum. How could she know? How could her mother know? How could anyone imagine that within seconds she would be stabbed by a complete stranger and left to die? Yours was a shocking and horrific act of violence. It was not just an innocent little girl's life that you took away that day. You've destroyed her family's life too. We heard a moving victim personal statement from Lilia's mother, whose life is now consumed by grief over the loss of her firstborn child, whose memory she will keep alive by erecting a monument near where Lilia was killed. The monument would depict Lilia playing with her hula hoop, just as she was doing in the final few seconds of her life. We heard from Lilia's stepfather, who loved Lilia as his own. He described her as a little girl with a beautiful soul and strong personality, who loved drawing and painting. He also describes how the family has been affected and how Lilia's little sister bursts into tears every so often because she misses her big sister, her protector. Nothing I can do or say today can relieve the pain of losing Lilia. No term of years will seem sufficient punishment to Lilia's loved ones for your crime. No term of years will begin to compensate them for their loss. We will never know exactly what was going through your mind that day when you circled the streets of Boston, apparently looking for a suitable victim. As to your background, we know that you arrived here in 2018 from Lithuania seeking work. It was in the period between 2018 and 2021 that you probably first developed symptoms of schizophrenia. In 2020, you had a run-in with the police after using a pepper spray on a woman. When you were arrested, you displayed strange behaviour, referring to yourself as Lucifer and saying that NASA had implanted a chip in your body. You were sectioned on that occasion. Whilst in hospital, you attacked a nurse without provocation and suggested that you did this because you were subject to mind control. You returned to Lithuania soon after that and were started on antipsychotic medication. You were a user of drugs, including cannabis and amphetamine, despite knowing that this was liable to worsen your schizophrenia. You returned to the United Kingdom in early July 2022, and you lived in a shared house on Thorold Street, Boston. You did not have much to do with your housemates and even got into a fight with one of them. Then on the 26th of July 2022, you walked into a branch of Wilko's and bought a knife. It was an ordinary kitchen knife, but it is the same one that you would later use to kill. 2 days later, on the 28th of July 2022, just after 5 p.m, you left your house with a knife hidden in your trousers and began walking around Boston. Meticulous analysis of footage from several CCTV cameras in the area has enabled your route to be traced. What that shows is that you walked around and around the same area in Boston, apparently in search of a victim. You walked past several people and children but he kept returning to the same area around Fountain Lane. That was where Lilia and her sister were playing. You watched the little girls from a distance, and you waited. An off-duty police officer, DC Andrew Pearson, happened to be walking along Fountain Lane, and you waited until he had walked past where the girls were playing. Then at 6:15, you did the unthinkable. You headed straight towards the girls, quickening your pace as you neared. You pulled out the knife, and almost as soon as you reached the unsuspecting Lilia, you plunged the knife into her heart. You did this with such force that you lifted Lilia off the ground before she was thrown back against metal shutters. You then ran off, heading straight for Thorold Street, where you tried to hide the knife behind a radiator. Lilia's mum rushed out, having heard screams. And as she did so, she saw what no parent should ever have to see. The sight of her beloved daughter lying on the pavement, bleeding out. Despite the best efforts of DC Pearson, who heard the screams and came to help, paramedics and doctors, Lilia could not be saved. The knife had penetrated her heart, and she didn't stand a chance. Over the next 2 days, you contacted various family members asking for money so that you could return to Lithuania. You did not tell them what you had done. You also shaved off your beard. You would probably have escaped to Lithuania were it not for the fact that a media appeal led to you being recognised by one of your flatmates, who called the police. You were arrested on the afternoon of the 30th of July 2022. During your interviews, you admitted killing Lilia, but said that you did it because you were being controlled by a chip that had been implanted in your body by NASA. You said there were voices in your head telling you to stab, and made you choose the bigger of the two girls. Since your arrest, your mental state has deteriorated markedly. You were transferred to Rampton High Security Hospital in December 2022, and you have been there ever since. You are treated by psychiatrists who assessed you as being severely mentally unwell. Until July 2025, you were not fit to stand trial. It was only once your mental state had improved to the point that you were able to understand court proceedings and give instructions to your lawyers that the trial process was commenced. Although you accepted that you had killed Lilia, your case was that because of your schizophrenia, your ability to exercise self-control and make rational judgments was substantially impaired. If the jury had accepted that, then you would have been guilty of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. However, the jury, no doubt considering the way in which you appeared to select a victim and took steps to try and conceal the knife and make your escape afterwards, did not accept that your abilities were substantially impaired, and they found you guilty of murder. I have read several psychiatric reports, including those of Dr. Cumming, Dr. Rogers, and Dr. Latham, as well as an update from Dr. Emma McPhail, consultant forensic psychiatrist, and 2 further recent reports from other psychiatrists. Dr. McPhail's report is dated the 19th of February 2026. In it, she confirms that your illness remains of a nature and degree that makes continued detention in hospital appropriate for medical treatment and necessary in the interest of your health and safety and for the protection of others. The risk that you present to others is described as grave, to the level of murder. And Dr. McPhail expresses concern that the risk of violence would increase without ongoing treatment for your mental disorder. I turn now to the approach to sentence. There is only one sentence that the law allows me to pass for the offence of murder, and that is a life sentence. I therefore sentence you to imprisonment for life. I am required to specify the minimum term that must elapse before you can be considered for release on licence by the parole board. That is the minimum term that you will serve before you could even be considered for release. It does not mean that you will be released after serving your minimum term. By Schedule 21 to the Sentencing Act 2020, Parliament has determined the starting points depending on whether the seriousness of the offending was exceptionally high, particularly high, where a person takes a knife to the scene and commits murder, and where the offender is under the age of 18 at the time of the offence. It should be borne in mind that these gradations of seriousness apply within the context of murder, which is already offending of a very serious nature. It was submitted by the Crown that the seriousness of the offending here can be said to fall within the exceptionally high category because it involved the murder of a child involving a substantial degree of planning. That's paragraph 22BA of Schedule 21. For an offence in that category, the appropriate starting point is a whole life order. I'm quite satisfied that this is not such a case. Whilst there was an element of planning here, it was nowhere near the level to warrant a whole life order. It was also submitted that the offence falls in the alternative into paragraph 3.1 of the 2020 Act, where the starting point is 30 years. However, that starting point applies to offences akin to those set out in paragraph 3.2 of Schedule 21. These include murders of 2 or more persons or murders involving sadistic or sexual conduct. Once again, serious though your offence was, it cannot be said to be an offence of particularly high seriousness in the context of what is already a very serious offence. In my judgment, this offence falls into paragraph 4.2 of Schedule 21, as you took a knife to the scene intending to commit murder. That gives rise to a starting point for the minimum term of 25 years. Having determined that starting point of 25 years, I am then required to take into account the aggravating and mitigating factors that apply in your case. Of the statutory aggravating factors set out in paragraph 9 of Schedule 21, there are 2 that could apply, the first being that there was a significant degree of planning or premeditation. You left your home that day armed with a knife. It's clear from your actions subsequently that you intended to use it, albeit you may not have known against whom. Whilst the taking of the knife is to some extent accounted for by the starting point, it is not inappropriate to take it into account as an element contributing to the planning overall. Your actions in Boston, including walking around the area several times, waiting until the coast was clear of adults before attacking your victim, did, in my judgment, involve some planning. Your attacks were not impulsive. That degree of planning is sufficient, in my judgment, to amount to significant planning, but only just. The other aggravating factor of note is that your victim, Lilia, was particularly vulnerable. She was just a little girl, aged 9. It was submitted that the aggravating factor at paragraph 9c, inflicting mental or physical suffering before death, also applies here. I disagree. The actual attack lasted no more than a second. Though it was fatal, it was not a prolonged attack, and nor was it carried out in a way that inflicted more suffering before death. None of the other listed factors apply. Mr. Donnellan for the Crown submits that some other unlisted factors should also be treated as aggravating. The first of these is that the offence was committed in the presence of another child. I accept that this is an aggravating feature, as was the fact that the murder took place in public. It's further submitted that you were under the influence of drugs at the time of the offence. Whilst there was evidence of drug use, the toxicology evidence was not conclusive, stating only that the results do not exclude the possible presence of drugs at the time of the incident. what you said to your mother in conversations after the incident about drug taking cannot be treated as conclusive either. As I cannot be sure that you were under the influence at the time of the offence, I do not treat this as a further aggravating factor. Turning now to the mitigating features, the first of these is that you suffered from a mental disorder, lowering your degree of culpability. I have considered the Sentencing Council's guidelines on sentencing offenders with mental disorders. That states that culpability may be reduced if there is a sufficient connection between the impairment in question and the offending behaviour, such as to lower culpability. The psychiatric evidence in this regard was given at trial by Dr. Cumming. He was clear that as a result of being in a psychotic state at the time, your ability to exercise self-control or to make rational judgments was substantially impaired. That view was shared by Dr. Latham and Dr. Rogers. Of course, the jury's verdict in this case, which rejected the partial defence of diminished responsibility, means that your ability in these respects was not substantially impaired. However, I am satisfied that even though your ability was not substantially impaired, it was impaired to some extent, and that contributed in part to the commission of the offence. That does have the effect of lowering your culpability for the offending to some extent. It is also relevant to note that very quickly after the offence, your mental condition deteriorated to the point where clearly your mental functioning was very substantially impaired. Taking into account all of these matters, I treat your mental disorder at the time of the offence as a significant mitigating feature. A further mitigating factor is that you have no previous convictions or cautions. It's also relevant to note, in my judgment, that whilst you did not plead guilty to murder, you have admitted to the killing from the outset, and I give you some credit for that. Balancing these aggravating and mitigating factors, I have reached the following conclusion. The significant aggravating features of planning, selecting a particularly vulnerable victim, and the presence of another child, which on their own would result in an uplift of 4 years from the starting point, are balanced by the mitigating features and in particular your mental disorder. Accordingly, the minimum term in your case is 25 years. Deividas Skebas, the sentence I pass on you is as follows. For the murder of Lilia Valutyte, I sentence you to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. From that minimum term, there must be deducted the number of days you've spent on remand for this offence. I'm told that that number is 1,305 days, or 3 years, 209 days. The minimum term left to be served is therefore 21 years, 156 days. Ordinarily, that sentence would mean your immediate transfer to prison. However, your current mental health state is such that alternative arrangements may have to be made. It is a matter for the Secretary of State to decide whether you should be transferred to, or in this case remain in, Rampton High Security Hospital for treatment. It is important to emphasise, so that you and all those viewing this sentence can understand the position, that the minimum term is just that, a minimum period which cannot be reduced in any way. If you are at any point well enough to be discharged from hospital, you will return to prison to serve your sentence and the remainder of your minimum term. You will only be eligible for release after your minimum term is served. Even then, there is no guarantee that you will be released at that time or at any particular time thereafter. It is only if the parole board decides that you are no longer a danger to society and fit to be released that you will be released. That will not be before you have served every day of your minimum term. Even if you are released after serving your minimum term, you will remain subject to licence for the rest of your life. That means you may be recalled to continue your life sentence at any time if considered appropriate. It is in these ways that a life sentence with a minimum term protects the public for the future. the victim surcharges to be paid. I end by making a commendation for DC Andrew Pearson. He was off duty and he could have walked away, but in the true spirit of public service, he stayed and helped and did what he could. He should be commended for that. That concludes the sentencing remarks.